Hey creeps, it's Horror Free for All. Continuing my passion project I affectionately call Gems from the Crypt, a series where we look at full-length feature movies that, in my opinion, fit right at home with one of my favorite horror anthology shows ever made, Tales from the Crypt. Now, Tales from the Crypt also had a movie spin-off series that lasted 3 movies, and there was a couple of subsequent movies that were, I guess, supposed to be in the franchise at one point that either never got made or got made as their own entities. And while those could be fun to talk about in future reviews or installments in this series for their own right, I like to find movies that people don't necessarily associate with the franchise more so than the ones that are associated. And I found a delightfully fucked up dark comedy, crime thriller horror movie from 1998 written and directed by Peter Berg to discuss for this specific episode. And we're going to be looking at Very Bad Things. Now, Very Bad Things is actually included on this 4-disc, or I guess 2-disc, 4-movie collection I got from a mom and pop video store a while back. And I sadly have never gotten around to watching it until the night of me making this video for you all. And I have to say up front, I fucking loved this movie. You know, there's a part of me that says this movie could only be made in the 90s. But given the track record that happened in the mid-2000s and even in the 2010s of similar ideas of bachelor and bachelorette parties going to Vegas and getting into hijinks there, and it perhaps getting in the way of a wedding that's supposed to happen later on in the movie, this one was definitely ahead of the curve on that. But the style of movie here is what I'm really getting at. I think for this being a dark comedy, you would really have to have a warped, fucked up sense of humor to really understand the punchlines and the jokes to be had here. And I think for someone like me who's an intellectual and has a depraved sense of humor inherently, this is the kind of movie that's kind of tailor-made for me. So I might be case-specific here when I say I absolutely love this movie. I don't know the general consensus out there, but I think this honestly could be one of my favorite movies ever made. And that's saying something because I have seen a lot of media, and I try to associate media that I watch with stuff that I already love. But this, I cannot wait to discuss. So let's get into what you're going to expect out of the movie. So the general premise is that there is a groom-to-be who's played by Jon Favreau. If you don't know who he is, he directed the Iron Man movie. He also directed movies like Elf. He starred in many other things as well. He plays Happy Hogan in the MCU. He's played a few characters in comedy movies that I've seen, like Four Christmases, Couples Retreat, and the list goes on. He is about to go on a bachelor party trip to Las Vegas with his 4 friends. And some of these actors you can recognize from things if you've seen, you know, a handful of decent bro media outside of this film. First and foremost, we have Jeremy Pivens, who you might recognize from the television show Entourage. We have Daniel Stern, who played Marv in the first 2 Home Alone movies. And we have Christian Slater, who got his start in Tales from the Dark Side from the 1980s. He even starred in the Tales from the Dark Side movie. He played in the movie with Winona Ryder called Heathers. The list goes on. And maybe some other actors you might recognize. But there's also a young Cameron Diaz. And Cameron Diaz, if you live under a rock, you might not know who she is. But at one point, she was a hot commodity in Hollywood, starring in movies like The Mask, There's Something About Mary, Charlie's Angels, The Sweetest Thing, the list goes on. She plays the fiance of Jon Favreau's character in this film, and she does not want her soon-to-be husband to go on this bachelor party. She thinks it's going to be a bad idea because she has an inkling about his friend group and how toxic they can be. But soon enough, once Jon Favreau's character talks her down and says, hey, everything's going to be all right, you know, it's just going to be an innocent bachelor party, we get to meet the cast of characters that we're going to be experiencing for the rest of the film. And they all have their own distinct personalities. You have this one guy with glasses. I don't know the name of the actor off the top of my head, but I think his name could be... well, I don't know if it's on here. Leland Orser, maybe? Could be him. You have him, he's more of a quiet guy. You have Jeremy Piven's character, who is a brother of Daniel Stern's character, and both of them have some pre-existing relationship problems. Like Jeremy Pivens is down on his luck guy. He's kind of looking for some romance, maybe some action while they're in Vegas. And Daniel Stern has a happy marriage, but he has 2 kids who are disabled. So he has a short fuse, let's just say. And then we have Christian Slater's character, who is a scummy real estate agent who has called ahead for this stripper to come to their bachelor pad that they're going to be staying at in Las Vegas. And on the phone, we overhear that she might be willing to do some stuff for extra charges outside of just dancing topless. But once the guys arrive in Vegas, let's just say they partake in booze and drugs, and shit gets out of hand real quick once the stripper arrives to the hotel room. And while the stripper is getting, freaky and dancing topless and doing typical bachelor party stuff, this prompts one specific character to want to pay extra for some additional services. And let's just say there's some additional services done in a bathroom with 2 naked individuals. But during this excursion into the wild side of the night, something happens to the stripper that possibly takes her life in a bloody, over-the-top fashion. And this, of course, prompts the attention of all the gentlemen, who freak out in the moment, given the situation, and they end up breaking a glass coffee table, and shit has already been broken beforehand because of the, drugs and alcohol. And they realize the situation that they're currently in is totally fucked up, and they're going to have to act quick in order to essentially save their friend's hide. So the guys led by Christian Slater, who is this sociopathic real estate guy in his normal life, comes up with a plan that will save everybody's ass. They're going to have to clean up the crime scene, dispose of the body out in the desert to avoid calling the cops. But some people in the friend group, including the groom himself and I think another guy, are very apprehensive in doing this, and they think the moral play is to just call the police and say it was an accident. But in doing so, that can potentially hamper not only the one particular guy from attending the wedding that's going to happen in a few days, but it's also going to, expose them of what they were actually doing with the woman in the apartment. So they take a plurality vote and they decide to dismember the woman. But before they can do so, a security guard for the hotel comes to the room and lets himself in. And after the guys are trying to swoon him and get him out of the way, he potentially ends up seeing what happens. And let's just say they have to find a solution to take care of him quickly. And it happens in a pretty bloody fashion in its own right. So now they have 2 dead people to deal with and dismember. The gentlemen decide to keep with their pact, and they head to, I guess, a local Target or something to grab all the necessary equipment to clean up the hotel room, gather up all the evidence, clean up all the blood and what have you, and get out of the hotel room as soon as possible and head out to the desert to dispose of the bodies. And we see them do this in an elaborate fashion where they grab some suitcases and, take a saw and start cutting up some limbs. And they stuff it in the suitcases and they head out to the desert. But almost immediately, once it comes time to dispose of the bodies, we see that already there's some dissension going on within the group, and some people are already starting to show cracks in their psyche. And once the bodies are put where they're put, very quickly, once the gentlemen come back from Las Vegas to their normal life, and they're waiting out the next few days until Jon Favreau's character's wedding with his fiancée Cameron Diaz, shit starts hitting the fan very quickly. It all begins with Daniel Stern's character when he's out in an outing with his family at a local mini-mart at a gas station, and he thinks he's being followed and what have you, and this causes a whole scene that potentially harms his wife's face. And we see later on that night at a rehearsal dinner in preparation for the wedding that's going to happen that the guy has lost his shit. and they have an altercation out in the parking lot, and let's just say a very over-the-top scene happens in a way that you don't see coming, but let's just say something happens to a particular gentleman in question, and he may or may not lose his life. And then the movie continues to spiral from there once another character completely freaks out over the decision that they made involving that situation in the parking lot, and we see this over-the-top reaction at a funeral and what have you with them, and this public freak out at a restaurant, and the guys start to see that some of the friends are becoming loose cannons, and if it becomes a point where they're going to have to take care of each other, they're going to, because of this pact, and because that they're so in too deep in what they've already done, they look foolish not to continue on. And this, of course, petrifies the groom, who never really asked for any of this, but he can't help but think in the back of his mind, even though it's never actually said in the movie, that we know as the audience that what his fiance told him came true, and he can't bring himself to admit that. But as the movie goes along, we see more dissension rise. Another character comes into question that might have some information that they have to get taken care of, and then we learn after they're potentially taken care of what's going to happen with Jon Favreau and Cameron Diaz moving forward with a certain set of characters. And then it comes to the day of the wedding, where all hell breaks loose with one particular character kind of losing their shit again. And we see something happen to them, and of course, there's a plot twist that you don't necessarily see coming involving Cameron Diaz that comes later on in the film that provides a new context moving forward for the remaining gentlemen in question. And there's a stipulation in place for these gentlemen to follow to keep the status quo. But there's a twist by the end of the film that you don't see coming whatsoever. And it ends in such a morbid way, and it's perversely dark and very Tales from the Crypt like. And that's all I'll say. But that in the gist is what you're going to expect out of this movie. Very bad things. Now I'm going to say this up front. I'm going to be honest. I don't have any objective flaws with the film whatsoever. So we're going to just kind of gush about it and then just talk about why I think it fits in Tales from the Crypt. So first and foremost, I think that this movie is competently made and directed. It has a very interesting way of laying out its story. It's very hit the ground running in its pace. And for like an hour and 40-minute movie, this film flies by. And a lot of it has to deal with the characters being as lively as they are, being as distinct as they are, and being as well performed as they are. The show stealers to me in this film are Jon Favreau, Daniel Stern, and Christian Slater. Even Jeremy Pivens is great when we see him in the film. And I'm going to say a lot of these gentlemen really tapped into something electric here. And they all had great chemistry. And the concept, while it sounds very Hangover-like or Rough Night-like, if you've seen that Kate McKinnon movie that's basically a ripoff of this, but in like a more modern, overly comedic way, this film is literally the template of what makes those movies work. What I'm going to say about this movie in comparison to those is that this film is way more ballsier than those movies ever were. This film heavily leans into the crime, thriller, horror side of things just as much as it does the dark comedy angle. And I've seen some people, from what I have been able to expose myself to about opinion of this movie, say that this movie isn't funny. They didn't find it funny, so they don't get the appeal of it being a dark comedy. But even if you don't see that, you can definitely see that it has this way of carrying its story and the characters in a EC Comics morality tale kind of way. And I think, for better or for worse, that is what makes this story actually funny. Because there's irony in the situation with all these characters being at odds with each other, and essentially they're an unlikely group of friends reluctantly spending time together at a bachelor party, and then reluctantly spending more time together than they probably want to because of this shared experience. You see that the desperation and them losing their fucking shit constantly, it plays off of their existing dynamics that we already got a pretty much of a rich sense of beforehand. And I think that's what makes this movie funny, is because they know that they can't go to anybody. They can't go to the authorities because if they do, they run the risk of their friends fucking killing them. And it's insane to think about it like that, but it provides a lot of shock, funny moments in the movie. And I'm going to say one up front that I was not expecting to laugh at. Involves a scene with the minivan and Daniel Stern. And I'm just going to leave it at that. But holy fuck, I legit was in tears from how that scene played out. It was just over the top and fucking insane. But that's the beauty of this movie. You have these characters who are legit driven mad by not only what they had to do in Vegas, but the guilt of that, and also worrying about their friends possibly turning against them. And it's just a very unique story to take in, all said and done, involving that. It's just something electric happening. You have to watch it to understand what I'm saying, but the story is incredible. Now, I'm going to say this now. It is a mean fucking movie. This movie just progressively gets worse and worse and worse and worse for every character involved. But in some weird way, you can live vicariously through this, because at the end of the day, this is a piece of fiction. This isn't real life, but it exacerbates the worst possible scenario that could happen in a scenario like it. And it plays on that extremism to highlight a point, which is what, in my opinion, Tales from the Crypt and EC Comics has historically done super well. This story feels straight out of something that you would see in shock suspense stories or crime suspense stories from the EC Comics brand. And a lot of those stories were actually adapted in the Tales from the Crypt TV show. Now, while this story here doesn't have abject monsters or supernatural phenomenon, and it's definitely leaning more crime and thriller in nature, it has that EC Comics heartbeat and the morality play. And you can clearly see the theme going on throughout this movie, and this is the heartbeat of why I think this ties perfectly in to Tales from the Crypt. And it's the message of being in too deep. And I think it is a beautiful metaphor to use a wedding and a, murder gone wrong and trying to cover up loose tracks, and combining those two ideas into being in too deep. Because a marriage in itself is, being deep into a relationship. Like, you're going into commitment, you're giving yourself to the cause of marriage. With the main character, Jon Favreau, and his fiancée, Cameron Diaz, we see that being a running theme with their character interactions in this movie. And arguably, the soon-to-be wife, played by Cameron Diaz, has her own fucking narcissistic side that pops out just as bad as the male characters in the movie. And we see that her wedding is so deep into planning, and this has been so deeply programmed within her mind that she feels that the wedding is almost just as important than what she learns from her husband that happened in Vegas to continue on. And since she's marrying this guy, she's also marrying into his commitment that he's made with his friends. And she even offers some insight of how to clean up loose ends herself near the end, which I'm not going to give the specifics away there, but that's as far as I'll go without giving too much away on that mild spoiler. But yeah, that works symmetrically well, tied to the gentleman stuff that happened in Vegas. Now, with the friends being in too deep with the murders and how the shit just keeps rolling forward and what have you there, you see that they have lost sight of why they did the choice to begin with. They didn't do this out of self-preservation, which it ended up turning into. What they really did this for was to save their friend's hide. But they realized that the more they get involved with something that they didn't necessarily have anything to do with, the more they keep trying to cover it up, the more involved they become. So now it's become about self-preservation for all of the men, because they know if they get caught, they're dragging themselves to jail along with their buddies. Even though they started out as accomplices in innocent parties, they might as well just be fucking given the same sentence as the other ones who are actually doing the heavy lifting in the story. And while the heavy lifting is only being done by one particular party, I should say, I will say that the characters that we do see by the end ended up there due to their own lack of backbone, due to their own, I guess, non-willingness to break a pact to their friends. And that keeps playing into what I keep saying about them being in too deep. So, going into the ending of it, where I think it really sends it home at being a Tales from the Crypt segment, is that there's no happy ending for any of these chumps. Especially given the context with the final note, they all got what was coming to them in some fashion. And while it's morbid and while it's no hunky-dory happy ending for anyone involved, and you kind of start to question what the point of the movie is, what it's saying with the message of it's a story about being in too deep is that crime, committing more crime to save your own ass or what have you, the list goes on. Karma is always going to be that boomerang, and karmic justice is always going to be the most palpable thing that you can send a story like this home with. And the karmic justice angle is commonly done in Tales from the Crypt, and I think this movie here executes it even better than almost all of the Tales from the Crypt stories that you have probably ever witnessed that has karmic justice as the punchline joke for the end of the story. And the way this movie executes it is so morbid and so out there, I have no words. It's just memorable in all the best ways possible. I can keep gushing all day about this movie, but if you haven't guessed, I think that everybody needs to see this movie at least one time in your life. This kind of reminds me of another film that I covered recently called Ravenous that came out a year after this movie in the 90s. And this and Ravenous are two golden examples of movies that feel like Tales from the Crypt that just aren't talked about on social media, that people need to go out of their way and watch, because there's some delightfully fucked up shit going on in both of these movies that resemble why people love Tales from the Crypt as a TV show. And in my opinion, I think that this movie, All Day in the Play, is a 5 out of 5 stars. Like I said, I have no flaws with this movie. As a matter of fact, I will probably watch this movie maybe once, maybe twice a year moving forward. That's how much I love this thing. And for me, this is getting the highest recommendation I've given so far in this series for you to go to check out. But if you haven't seen my other ones, you should also go check out the other ones I recommended, especially Ravenous. But yeah, take that with a grain of salt, because we have so much more content in this series to cover. But yeah, that's all I have to say. So, with that being said, that was Very Bad Things. If you've seen the movie before, what's your thoughts on the film? Do you have any pros? Do you have any cons with it? And as a hook point to end you on with, if you know any movies that you think that feels like Tales from the Crypt, let me know down in the comments section, and I might check them out and put them in a future episode. Till next time, take care.